Hey, everybody, back in the Gospel of John. Thanks for joining us as we continue here through chapter 12. A little bit of not filler because the content is important, but sort of a bridge today. We're trying to get through a couple of passages here. Let me read the first to you. We're starting in verse 20. Read a few verses here and kind of see what we can make of it. Now, among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew, then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life and those who hate their life will lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will be my servants also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor." Off the top of my head, Michael, I can't think of a corresponding passage like this in the other Gospels, and I think we should see this as an extension of what was said. Yesterday, we ended the passage we looked at in verse 19 with the Pharisees saying, "Look, the world has gone after him." Now we get a passage about outsiders, Greeks, Gentiles, coming to want to see Jesus, to want to hear Jesus. So none of the Gospels go as far down the Gentile path as certainly the book of Acts and Paul's writings. But John here, I think, gives us a pre-look, a little bit of a preview at some of the places that the gospel story is going to go. Now, it's interesting that we don't know if Jesus goes and meets with them or not, but what Jesus does say, and is a thing we've been talking about, the hour has come, my time. We've seen this over and over. Jesus did something, but it wasn't his time yet. My hour is not here. That's what first thing he told his mom at the wedding at Cana. Now we have this idea, the hour has come. So when we connect these things, what do we learn? That what Jesus has in mind for his mission and his time is being connected here with the broader context that goes beyond the Jewish people themselves, that reaches out, that Jesus is finding a hearing in people outside his own tradition. And again, we want to be careful with that, Michael. I mean, obviously, this doesn't take it as far as other parts of the Bible are going to, but I think it's a thing that John is trying to at least highlight as he tells the story this way.
There's absolutely Johannine distinctives in the inclusion of this kind of story, because ultimately what John's interested in is the revelation of Christ. And yes, that revelation has a way of both drawing people and repelling people, but it's not just the Jewish people. And I think it's worth noting that as we turn to this text, that there is this movement in the ancient world. There were Greeks, there were Gentiles who were interested in the morality of the Jews. It was certainly compelling, the idea that these people would keep strict order in their lives. And, there were many people who were very inquisitive about that, for sure. And many people did go to worship in Jerusalem, or at least go to check it out in Jerusalem. It drew more than just the Jewish worshipers themselves. So the context here is we have people coming from a wide geographic region. Certainly, we have that teased out in the book of Acts, right, where it's actually people with all of these different languages that begin to understand each other by the power of the Spirit. But here in this story, you have emphasized the fact that these Greeks, as John calls them, comes to the disciples, and specifically we have here comes to Philip, and commentators make note, no real reason to know why Philip, except Philip may have the most Gentile sounding name, the most Greek sounding name, and also the idea that Bethsaida isn't far from the Decalogue cities. No, what are they? It's Deca something city. Sorry that I can look that up here. But ultimately, Bethsaida is not far from some Greek settlements and cities. So the idea that there might be some interplay and relationship there is significant and possible. What I think is fascinating is how we see John telling us about Jesus's encounters here with the people who are not in the circle per se, people who you might think of as being kept out, and the barrier sort of separating them from the inner life of worship in Israel. And here we have this very cryptic teaching and this idea that the grain of wheat has to fall into the earth and die. But if it dies, it'll bear much fruit. And then this language about if you love your life, you're going to lose it. Those who hate it will keep it for eternal life. This is an amazing kind of move in which Jesus is prophesying using this spiritualistic teaching about what he is willing to do, right? He's willing to be that grain of wheat that dies so that new life can come on the other side. Jesus is teaching resurrection for himself, even as he has demonstrated resurrection power as it applies to Lazarus. And why are all these people interested in Jesus right now? Why in that last text was it said that the world is coming after him? Well, because Jesus has done this spectacular, over the top, death defeating kind of miracle. Well, what Jesus is doing here is making it clear, and John in red letter power is making sure that we know that Jesus is teaching not just about the power he has over death, but what he is willing to do to undo the power of death, that Jesus himself is willing to take on death. That's the amazing turn of the story, is that Jesus does not separate himself from death itself. He has the power to resurrect Lazarus, but yet Jesus is going to succumb to death by his own choosing. And that's the important turn theologically that John is making here. And before we push on, I want to make sure that we mention here, it's important that the texts like this, Clint, have been used in some really negative ways. The idea of those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. I think we need to be very careful taking a text like that out of context and applying it to ourselves, and saying that it's a laudable goal to hate the life that God has given to us. That needs to be put within a much broader theological construct. I think Jesus is teaching something here. I think it's very much revelation about what he is willing to do. He's willing to even give up his life so that life might be eternal. I think we need to be very careful when we find people taking small little sections of text like this and applying it in literalistic ways towards themselves. I think that's against what John is intending. I certainly don't think that's what Jesus was teaching.
I'd have to do some word study, Michael, but if I remember anywhere correctly, the word hate has to do with the turning away from. And so the idea here that those who turn away from selfishness, those who turn away from worldly things, this is certainly not calling for self-hatred or self-flagellation. This is a discipleship text. It's a commitment text, and I think it can only be read that way. Before we move on, just one quick note. If you've been with us through the study, you may remember that it was Philip who was called and then went to get someone else. And so Philip has, even in this book, a little bit of a reputation of facilitating meetings between Jesus and others. And if you know the book of Acts, somewhere in the early, maybe 8th chapter or so, you would find a story in which Philip encounters an Ethiopian eunuch, a man who in various ways is outside of the mainstream and outside of the norm, and preaches the gospel to him. So the presence or the naming of Philip here, I think, is intentional and certainly fits within a broader narrative. Obviously, we have to be careful not to make too much out of it, but there may be a good reason that John highlights this story with Philip in it, because Philip has done these kind of things in other places as well.
And as we turn here to 27, just a note to fill in that gap I left there. It's Decapolis is next to Bethsaida. So there we go.
So let's jump in there. Another interesting section here that allows us to continue on. Verse 27, now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it's for this reason I've come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice from heaven said, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing there heard it and said it was thunder. Others said an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of the world. Now the ruler of the world will be driven out. And I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he would die. The crowd answered, we've heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Jesus said to them, the light is with you a little longer. Walk while you have the light, so that the darkness may not overtake you. If you walk in the darkness, you do not know where you're going. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become children of light. This is very dense passage, lots of stuff packed in here. Notice that this is, we're in John when you see a verse like this. Well, what would I say? Father, save me from the hour. No, this is why the hour has come. Again, evidence of what we've said many times. In John's portrayal of Jesus, Jesus is ready for what he has to do. He wants to do it. He has no doubt. He has no fear. He has no hesitation. And I think we see that in these words. Here, though, we have what is kind of the baptismal narrative in other places. A voice speaks, and some hear it, and some don't know they've heard it. Some think it's thunder or something else. And again, Jesus says, look, the voice is for your sake. I already know what the voice is telling me. I already have that figured out. I don't need the voice, but it's good for you to hear it. And then Jesus begins, and we'll see this repeated in the next several chapters. Jesus begins to have increasingly upfront conversations about his upcoming death and about what it means to be lifted up, to be sacrificed, and what the impact that is upon the believers and upon the world. And for John, that is a twofold reality. Jesus' saving of the believer is also Jesus' judgment of the world. Not only true in the Gospel of John, but very true in the Gospel of John. And passages like this, I think when we combine them down the road with other passages, we'll see they really cement that theme, I think, Michael.
If you want to put in your imagination the idea that this kind of hearing the voice is connected with baptism in other places, I do think it's really meaningful, and it's worth noting here that Jesus in this text is using this language of the Son of Man being lifted up, and then ultimately this idea of the cross being foreshadowed in this text is really significant. And the Johannine emphasis, you have to see this here when he turns back to this idea. And Jesus talks about the light is with you while it's here, walk in light, right? This connects back to the beginning of this book. It connects to even the telling of the narrative, where we've seen darkness used as a context or a setup for a story. We've talked about how that has something to say about the characters in that story and their ability to understand the revelation of Jesus. That is, Clint, what makes this telling of Jesus's life, I think, so rich, is the reality that at each and every stage, John is showing us that Jesus is not only upfront from day one about the truth of who he is. He's not only confident about who he is, but we get to see, though Jesus is in a sense unchanging, the way that people are changed by his revelation is the subject of this book. That when you hear the voice of God, Jesus is unfazed by it. Jesus says, I don't need to hear the voice of God, but now you have, and what difference will that make for you? And ultimately, that's this very kind of powerful movement that happens throughout the story, is that Jesus continually reveals what is going to happen, and at its core, what that means about who he is and the business he's here to be about. But at this moment here, Jesus is making it clear that this salvation letter is addressed to, and we want to point this out in verse 32, all people will be drawn to himself, right? And this connects to John, of course, the famous John 3:16, and that sort of communication of purpose. We just have in spades here, I think, this demonstration that Jesus, over and over and over again, whether or not you are a Jew in the synagogue hearing Jesus preach, or whether you are a Gentile coming to Jesus along with the hordes of people worshiping in Jerusalem, at the end of the day, Jesus will be lifted up, and the purpose is to draw those who will look to him to the truth of his salvific work, to the truth of what he's come to do for the sake of the world. And ultimately, Jesus is saying at the end of this text that while he's still there, while the light is still living, it's good for you to walk with that light, because the day is coming where darkness will once again live. But there's hope in the idea that there's children of light, that we might be those, even the church who receives the Gospel of John would have imagined themselves to be light bearers in the world that Jesus had called them to. And this kind of text forms and fashions the imagination to understand that.
Light and dark have been important themes since the first chapter of this book, and I think it's very interesting that that language comes at the end of a question, right? We've heard from the law of the Messiah. We've heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. So how do you say that the Son of Man would be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? And rather than engage in the questions, Jesus says, walk in the light while you have the opportunity. Come to me while you can. Pay attention. We've said it over and over in this book. John understands the work of Jesus to be self-evident as to who Jesus is. And Jesus says it here. Don't be in the darkness. Walk in the light. While you have the light, believe in it, that you might become children of light. And fascinating, I think, Michael, that rather than get into some theological argument, really even rather than answer their questions,
Yeah.
Jesus simply says, make the main thing, do the right thing, believe, and walk in a way that reflects that belief, literally, that is in the light. And that, I think, if we're going to, mine a passage like this for some discipleship implications, that's a good one in my estimation.
Well, and we actually see a little bit of disagreement in this text when we see how our Bible here breaks out and switches. You see that bold heading, the unbelief of the people, but those who were making the chapters and verses have a disagreement that it ends there. They include in verse 36, after Jesus had said this, he departed and hid from them. And I think that's significant. There's a way in which I think there's wisdom in Jesus talks about walking in the light while the light is still there, and then Jesus hides from them. That kind of revelation language in John, that is not an accident, the way that plays out, that Jesus is talking about revelation, but then there's hiding. Jesus will do this great miracle, and then he will retreat. And we see that that's kind of this movement that happens with the revelation of Christ, that there's a step forward, and then there's always something unexpected that comes with it. And I just think that's what makes John's account of Jesus so compelling in so many ways, is it isn't just one thing. It is always encompassing some form of mystery, which, if you take John seriously, what he's talking about is a deified person, a humanity and deity combined. And so it makes sense that there would be mystery and there would be some complication within the story. John tells it that way. And I think it's just fascinating that, even in the way that this particular Bible breaks it out, where the new category, unbelief of the people, chapter and verse, people who broke that out left a little bit more of that in there. And I think there's a real connection there as you finish the verse itself.
Yeah, and I would say that in the next couple of passages, again, we get a turning point. And then as we move into chapter 13, we really very much center ourselves on Jesus' work as he moves toward the cross. And so hope you can continue to be with us. Grateful that you'd be with us today. Hope you can join us next week as we continue through the next parts of the gospel.
Yeah, no doubt. If you found this helpful, a like would go a long ways towards helping others find it in their own studies, and subscribing would help you if you want to stick with us in studies like John. Certainly glad to have you with us, and see you next week.